Madam President, I want to speak about a subject that's on the hearts of most of us now as we approach not what is a coming constitutional crisis, but what is already a constitutional crisis, because this body is not functioning as the Congress, as the Constitution intended. The minority, under the rules of the Senate, is protected and has been. In the early days of the Senate, there was no cutting off of debate. In the early 1900s, a threshold of 67 was established in order to cut off debate. And then after the abuses of that filibuster requirement to cut off debate and the abuses in the civil rights era, indeed, the threshold was lowered to what we have in the Senate rules today, 60. But we are seeing that it is being abused. Under the Constitution, we have the checks and balances of the separate branches, but when a president is elected, the president is entitled to have the people that he wants to advise him to be a part of his team to be confirmed. And it has always been the practice under the Constitution. Not a supermajority vote, as is required for treaties, but a simple majority in the approval of the nominations. But the issue in front of us is whether or not the president will be entitled to have approved by the Senate the people that he has put forth to head the agencies and the department of his administration. And that is what has brought us to the constitutional crisis where we are now finding ourselves ready to act. Congress has failed to put aside political differences to find common sense solutions, not only in the issue of approval of the president's appointments, but on so many of our nation's pressing problems. Let's start out with this charade that we call the sequester. The sequester is a meat cleaver approach to budgeting. I dare say in the minds of most of the senators that it was never intended to go into effect. It was the meat cleaver hanging over the head a year and a half ago of the appointed super committee that after the initial $1 trillion of spending cuts was made on the budget over a 10-year period, which was done, the super committee was to come along and work out deficit reduction of another, with a target somewhere around $4 trillion of total. And what was to encourage the super committee was this meat cleaver hanging over their heads, or guillotine hanging over all the heads that nobody wanted, which was cuts across the board without regard to programs, across the board in discretionary programs, defense and non-defense discretionary programs. And so, such across-the-board budget cuts, is that the way to go about budgeting and making appropriations decisions? Those kind of meat cleaver approaches do real damage to people's everyday lives. And in the long run, the sequester is certainly going to hurt our national defense, our national security, our nation's ability to compete economically with other countries. If we see these kind of cuts in this ideological, without regard to programs, continue, then we're going to be in serious trouble. Now, we can continue to have both sides of the aisle point fingers at each other, but isn't it about time that we get rid of this approach to budget, the sequester, and start talking about how we can get the job done? Well, the ranking member of the Finance Committee is here. He is one of my dear personal friends. I believe he is very sincere, along with the chairman of the committee, the Finance Committee, to really take on tax reform. Are we happy with the tax code that we have? Do we think it has much too much complication? And could not its streamlining, particularly with tax expenditures, which are tax deductions and tax credits, that almost every special interest in the world has their own special tax expenditure? Could we not clear out a lot of them, which produces revenue, and use that revenue in order to lower tax rates and also use some of it to lower the deficit? Well, we need to close some of those loopholes, and I'm hopeful with the leadership of Senator Baucus and Senator Hatch that we're going to be able to do that. But there are a lot of other things in there. It's no surprise that I have been speaking of subsidies that go to companies like oil companies that have outlived their usefulness, that a century ago were given in the tax code as incentives to drill for oil. Do we really think that oil companies need those financial incentives now? What about the offshore tax dodges? I think it's also obvious that when you look at the Medicare drug program, you know that the taxpayers of this country, through their government, got a break on the cost of prescription drugs that we supply to Medicaid and to the Department of Defense and to the Veterans Administration. But when it comes to if you have been getting that price break on your drugs through Medicaid, but you now turn 65 and you get your drugs through Medicare, the U.S. government does not get the break, the discount on the drugs through Medicare. The very same people that were getting them under Medicaid now are getting them by Medicare because they've passed the threshold of age 65. Same drugs, same people. Government is paying it, but the government is paying a much higher price. That could be worth a savings of $140 billion to the U.S. taxpayer over the course of a decade. Now you do the math on just these few examples that I have given in this short little speech, and it adds up well over $1 trillion. And that's just a starter. And there's hundreds of billions of dollars more that might be saved by closing some of these tax loopholes. I think we need to keep in mind that not all tax deductions are bad. Some serve very legitimate purposes. But here we are, and we come back to the gridlock that we are experiencing. And so, we passed a budget resolution in the Budget Committee. It passes out here on the floor of the Senate. The House of Representatives has passed a budget resolution, albeit much different than the one. The normal process around here is to try to work out your differences and to do it as ladies and gentlemen, with comity. But you know, we can't even get a motion approved here in order to go to a conference committee to work out the differences between the House and the Senate budget resolutions. And so I would continue to plead with our colleagues to allow this to move forward. No less than one of the most stellar members of this body, Senator McCain, has called for the naming of the conference committee. My Republican colleague that helps me lead the Aging Committee, Senator Collins, has called for the naming of the conference committee. So let's do it. Let's end the gridlock on this one little thing. Let's compromise, and let's start using some common sense. If we do, you'll see a chorus of amens from our fellow countrymen. Madam President, I yield the floor.